Before sunrise on August 15, 2026, the northern side of Flores Island was still in the quiet hours of early morning. The communities scattered across East Nusa Tenggara had no visible warning of what was about to happen beneath the sea. At 5:58 a.m. local time, a powerful earthquake ruptured offshore near Nagakeo. Indonesia's meteorological agency, BMKG, later classified the event at magnitude 7, with a shallow depth of about 15 kilometers and an epicenter roughly 30 kilometers northeast of Mbe. Within seconds, motion generated far below the surface reached towns and villages across the region. Buildings shook. Roads, walls, roofs, and slopes were suddenly subjected to forces they had not been carrying moments earlier. Across Flores, the first problem was not understanding the geology. It was reacting to the movement itself. A major earthquake gives people very little time to interpret what is happening. There is no distant cloud bank to watch, no forecast cone moving across a map, no visible approach. The ground simply changes behavior. Structures designed to remain still begin moving laterally. Objects shift, masonry cracks, loose materials fall. In mountainous terrain, slopes can fail without waiting for the shaking to end. The event that struck Flores was strong enough to be felt across a wide region, and its offshore location immediately created another concern. The earthquake had occurred beneath the sea. That meant authorities had to determine, quickly and with incomplete information, whether the rupture had displaced enough water to generate a dangerous tsunami. BMKG issued a tsunami warning within minutes. For coastal communities, this transformed the emergency. The threat was no longer confined to damaged buildings or unstable ground. People near the shoreline had to consider what might be traveling toward them from beyond the horizon. In a tsunami emergency, waiting for visual confirmation can be fatal. Waves move across deep ocean very differently from ordinary wind-driven surf, and by the time a sudden rise or withdrawal of the sea becomes obvious, evacuation time may already be disappearing. The warning system, therefore, had to act before scientists possessed a complete picture of the rupture. Models were run. Sea level instruments were watched. Coastal areas were assigned warning levels. Residents in vulnerable locations were urged to move away from the water and towards safer ground. The sequence unfolded quickly because every minute mattered. The earthquake itself had lasted only a short time, but the decisions it triggered now extended across a much larger area. Flores is not an isolated point on a map. Its coastline faces narrow seas, neighboring islands, fishing communities, ports, roads, settlements, and steep terrain. A wave generated in one location can reach different shores at different times, and local geography can amplify or reduce its height. At the same moment, emergency officials were trying to understand damage on land. Reports began arriving unevenly. Some places could communicate, others could not. Power failures and damaged infrastructure complicated the flow of information. Landslides blocked sections of road, including routes that would later become important for rescue access. In the first hours of a disaster, silence from a community does not mean that nothing happened there. It can mean that communication lines have failed, roads are impassable, electricity is gone, or local responders are occupied with immediate emergencies. That uncertainty made the developing picture difficult to read. The strongest confirmed facts came from instruments: the magnitude, the location, the depth, the continuing seismic activity. The human consequences would take longer to establish. Offshore, monitoring stations began recording the sea's response. Smaller tsunami waves were detected at several coastal locations. They were not the catastrophic walls of water that Indonesians remember from the country's worst historical disasters, but their presence confirmed that the earthquake had transferred energy into the ocean. In Riung, a coastal village in Ngada Regency, later observations recorded a wave around 1.5 meters high. Other locations registered lower sea level changes. Those measurements mattered because they helped authorities judge whether the threat was growing, remaining limited, or passing. As new data arrived, the probability of a major tsunami diminished. By 7:31 a.m. Western Indonesian time, BMKG declared that the tsunami threat had ended. For communities that had moved away from the shore, that announcement removed one immediate danger. It did not restore normal life. The earthquake had already damaged buildings, disrupted roads, triggered landslides, and begun a sequence of aftershocks. The relief associated with the lifted tsunami warning existed alongside a different kind of uncertainty. People could move away from the coast, but they could not move away from the fault system beneath the region. After a major rupture, the crust does not instantly return to equilibrium. Stress has been changed across the surrounding rock, and smaller earthquakes often follow while the system adjusts. Some of those tremors can be strong enough to cause additional damage, especially to structures weakened by the initial shock. In Flores, aftershocks began appearing quickly on monitoring networks. Each new jolt carried a practical consequence. A cracked wall that had remained standing might no longer be reliable. A slope loosened by the main shock could fail under later movement or rain. Rescue work around damaged buildings would have to proceed with the knowledge that the ground could shake again. This was the beginning of a second phase of the emergency. one less sudden than the first, but potentially prolonged. The main earthquake had altered the physical landscape and the decisions people now had to make within it. Roads that had connected communities before dawn could no longer be assumed safe. Hospitals and clinics had to evaluate damaged structures while treating the injured. Families faced the question of whether to re-enter homes that appeared intact from the outside, but might have suffered hidden structural damage. Officials had to determine which villages had been reached, which remained cut off, and where heavy equipment could travel. None of those tasks could be completed from the magnitude number alone. A magnitude describes the size of the earthquake at its source. It does not reveal, by itself, how every village experienced the shaking, which building failed, where a slope collapsed, or how quickly assistance can arrive. Geography transforms seismic energy into very different outcomes from one location to another. Flores contains steep mountains, narrow roads, coastal settlements, and communities separated by terrain that becomes difficult when landslides occur. The same earthquake can therefore produce severe damage in one district and less in another, even when the distance from the epicenter is similar. As daylight spread across the island, the scale of the event became easier to see, but not yet easier to measure. Broken structures, blocked routes, frightened residents, and emergency crews were part of a picture still forming. Reports would change as rescuers entered affected areas and authorities reconciled information from different districts. The number of casualties was still provisional. Damage totals were incomplete. Some communities had not yet been fully assessed. What was certain was that Flores had experienced one of the strongest earthquakes to strike the region in years, and the disaster had begun before most of the country understood its scale. The immediate tsunami danger had passed, but the larger questions were only opening. Why had such a powerful rupture occurred beneath this part of Indonesia? What did the growing sequence of aftershocks reveal about the fault that had moved? And, most unsettling of all, could the earthquake that people were already calling the main shock eventually prove to have been only the first major rupture in a longer sequence? Those questions could not be answered by fear, and they could not be answered by a single number on a seismic bulletin. Their explanation lay in the structure of the Indonesian archipelago itself, where moving plates, buried faults, and old geological boundaries have shaped the islands for millions of years. As rescue teams began moving toward the hardest-hit districts, instruments across the region continued recording the motion beneath Flores, capturing the first evidence of how the crust was adjusting after the sudden break. The first rescue teams moving toward the hardest-hit districts quickly discovered that the earthquake had created a problem larger than collapsed walls and injured residents. Access itself had become uncertain. Sections of road were blocked by landslides. Communication networks were unstable, and power failures made it harder for local authorities to establish which communities needed help most urgently. Flores is long, mountainous, and crossed by routes that often run between steep slopes and the sea. When those roads are cut, distance becomes more than a number on a map. A village only a few kilometers away can become effectively isolated if the only approach is buried beneath earth and rock. In the hours after the main shock, that geography began shaping the emergency as strongly as the shaking had. Nagakeo, the region closest to the epicentral area, became one of the greatest concerns because rescuers were struggling to reach it by road. Landslides had obstructed access, and mobile communications were disrupted. Officials tried alternative routes, while another team prepared to approach by sea. Elsewhere, helicopters and a rescue vessel were deployed to support logistics and possible evacuations. These decisions reflected a basic reality of disaster response in an archipelago. When roads fail, emergency operations must become three-dimensional, using land, sea, and air at once. Even then, reaching people is only the beginning. Heavy equipment may be needed to clear debris. Medical teams require safe places to work. Fuel, water, food, lighting, and communications have to move through the same damaged landscape as rescuers. The first verified damage reports showed how widely those resources would be needed. By later that day, Indonesia's disaster authorities had confirmed at least 47 deaths, while warning that assessments were still incomplete. At least 50 people had been taken to hospitals, and the number of casualties remained provisional because some remote communities had not yet been fully reached. Preliminary figures described 157 homes as heavily damaged, with dozens more suffering moderate damage and many others sustaining lighter structural impacts. Schools, health facilities, houses of worship, government offices, and other public buildings were also affected. Those numbers were useful for coordinating assistance, but they could not capture the uneven nature of what had happened. A house counted as damaged might still shelter a family. Another might be too unstable to enter. A school listed in a preliminary assessment might have lost a wall, a roof, or an entire section. The difference matters because recovery depends on function, not simply on a tally. Maumere, the main town of Sika Regency, became one of the clearest examples of the earthquake's human cost. Buildings had failed there, and rescue workers searched through rubble for people believed trapped beneath collapsed sections. At the port, part of a structure came down, leaving a scene of broken concrete, dust, and twisted material that required careful removal. Search operations in a damaged building are slow because rescuers cannot simply move debris as quickly as possible. Every slab may be supporting another unstable section. Heavy machinery can accelerate clearing, but it can also shift weight onto voids where survivors might remain. Teams must listen, inspect, cut, lift, and brace. Aftershocks make the work even more dangerous because a structure that has already lost part of its support can fail again without warning. The challenge extended beyond Mamere. Reports from across 6 regencies describe landslides that buried or cut off remote villages. The Trans-Flores Highway, the island's principal overland corridor, was blocked in places, interrupting movement along a road that normally links communities across hundreds of kilometers. For rescue planners, the obstruction was more than an inconvenience. It affected how ambulances, excavators, food supplies, medical equipment, and personnel could be distributed. A damaged road can multiply the consequences of an earthquake by slowing every form of assistance that follows. In some areas, power outages added another layer of difficulty. Without electricity, phone charging becomes harder, lighting is limited after dark, pumps may stop operating, and health facilities can become dependent on backup systems. Communication problems also create uncertainty for families trying to contact relatives in other districts. Disaster agencies must distinguish between places from which no reports have arrived because damage is severe in places that are simply experiencing network failures. That process takes time, especially when terrain prevents rapid physical verification. Around 2,000 residents in Nagakeo had moved away from their homes, and similar decisions were being made elsewhere as people weighed the danger of remaining inside damaged structures against the difficulty of staying outdoors or in temporary shelters. Fear of aftershocks was not abstract. The seismic sequence continued throughout the day. By the afternoon, monitoring agencies had recorded more than 235 aftershocks, the strongest reaching around magnitude 6.2. Most were weaker, and many would have been felt only in limited areas, but the repeated movement meant that the earthquake was not experienced as a single finished event. For people living through it, time became divided between periods of stillness and the possibility of another jolt. That uncertainty influenced behavior in practical ways. Residents hesitated to return home. Patients were moved outside damaged medical buildings in some districts. Families gathered in open spaces where falling masonry posed less risk. Rescue teams worked under conditions in which the ground itself could interrupt their operations. Structures that survived the first rupture were now being tested repeatedly. Aftershocks can be especially dangerous when masonry is already cracked, columns have been weakened, walls have separated from frames, or foundations have shifted. A later tremor does not need to match the original earthquake to finish a collapse that has already begun. The continuing movement also complicated inspection. Engineers and local officials had to decide whether buildings were safe enough to re-enter, sometimes without the benefit of complete plans or sophisticated monitoring equipment. Damage that is obvious is often easier to judge than damage hidden inside a structural connection. A wall may look intact, while internal reinforcement has been stressed. A roof may remain level, even though supporting masonry is fractured. In such conditions, caution can feel excessive until the next aftershock arrives. The emergency also exposed differences between visible and invisible damage. A collapsed building commands immediate attention. A weakened bridge may look usable until traffic returns. A hillside can appear stable while cracks have opened beneath vegetation. Water lines, buried cables, and drainage systems can fail without producing an obvious surface sign. That is why the first day after a major earthquake is not only a rescue operation, it is also an expanding investigation into what still works. Authorities need to know which roads can carry heavy vehicles, which medical facilities remain functional, which schools can serve as shelters, and where fresh landslides might occur. None of these questions can be answered at once across a large, rugged island. As reports accumulated, a more detailed picture emerged from individual communities. Some people had escaped buildings before sections collapsed. Others were injured by falling material, or while attempting to flee. In Sika, a seminary assembly hall was damaged during morning religious activities, forcing those inside to leave quickly. In coastal and inland districts alike, the early instinct to move outside remained strong even after the tsunami warning was lifted. The sea was no longer the primary concern, but the buildings around people had become objects of suspicion. That change in perception is one of the lasting effects of a severe earthquake. A home that represented safety the previous night can feel uncertain after daylight reveals cracks across a wall. A familiar road can become threatening when boulders and soil have fallen from the slope above it. Ordinary surroundings acquire new meanings because the forces beneath them have suddenly become visible through damage. By evening, rescue crews were still trying to close gaps in the information coming from isolated areas, and the official figures remained subject to change. The growing aftershock sequence, meanwhile, was beginning to offer scientists another kind of information. Each small rupture marked a place where stress in the crust had shifted after the main event. Plotted together, those earthquakes could help reveal the geometry of the fault system that had moved beneath the Flores region. For the people above it, they were frightening interruptions. For seismologists, they were also measurements, pieces of evidence describing a rupture that could not be seen directly. Understanding what those signals meant required looking far deeper than the damaged roads and buildings, into a part of Indonesia where tectonic forces have been compressing, bending, and breaking the crust for millions of years. Those aftershocks were not random noise. Taken together, they began to outline the system that had moved beneath northern Flores. BMKG identified the source of the August 2026 earthquake as the Flores Back-Arc Thrust, a major compressional structure running along the northern side of the island chain. Unlike the more familiar image of Indonesia's tectonics along the Sunda Trench to the south, this fault system lies behind the volcanic arc. Its existence reflects the complicated way the Australian plate, the Sunda region, and smaller crustal blocks interact across eastern Indonesia. The geometry is not simple, and the motion is not confined to one clean boundary. The crust is being shortened, folded, and thrust in several places at once. In that setting, stress can accumulate for years before part of the fault suddenly slips. The result is an earthquake that may last less than a minute, but represents the release of deformation built over a much longer period. A thrust fault works by forcing one block of crust upward over another. When friction holds the blocks in place, motion does not stop at the scale of the tectonic plates. Instead, strain builds in the surrounding rock. The fault can remain locked even as regional forces continue pushing. Eventually, the stress exceeds the strength of the contact, and the locked section breaks. The rupture propagates across part of the fault surface, sending seismic waves outward through the crust. In an offshore setting, vertical movement can also disturb the seafloor, which is why thrust earthquakes are capable of generating tsunamis when the displacement is large enough and oriented in the right way. The August 2026 event had precisely the kind of shallow thrust mechanism that required rapid tsunami assessment. BMKG's analysis also emphasized that the broader Flores Back-Arc system is capable of producing earthquakes in the upper magnitude 7 range. That does not mean such an event is continuously imminent. It means the fault has the physical dimensions and tectonic setting to generate very large ruptures, a conclusion supported not only by models, but by history. For seismologists, the aftershock cloud offered one way to study how much of the system had actually moved. Aftershocks often cluster around and within the region affected by the main rupture. Their locations can reveal which sections of crust are adjusting, where stress has been redistributed, and how far the disturbed zone extends. The pattern is never a perfect map of the fault because earthquake locations have uncertainty and the crust may contain multiple structures. Even so, a dense sequence can help researchers infer the orientation and scale of the rupture more clearly than the main shock alone. This is why hundreds of smaller events matter scientifically. Each one adds another point to an invisible structure beneath the sea. Magnitude also helps explain why the August shock produced such widespread effects. The scale is logarithmic rather than linear. An increase of one whole magnitude represents roughly 32 times more energy release. A magnitude 7 earthquake, therefore belongs to a completely different class from the smaller tremors people may experience without major damage. The number itself does not determine the outcome because depth, distance, building quality, local ground conditions, and fault geometry all matter. But it tells scientists that an enormous amount of stored elastic energy was released during the rupture. That energy propagated through a region whose communities have lived with seismic hazards for generations. Flores has experienced destructive earthquakes before, and no event casts a longer shadow over the island's modern memory than December 12, 1992. On that day, another major thrust earthquake struck offshore north of Flores. Modern catalogs do not all report exactly the same magnitude, but USGS summaries describe the event at about magnitude 7. 8, while Indonesian sources commonly cite magnitude 7. 5. The difference reflects the use of different magnitude scales and later reassessments, not a dispute over whether the earthquake was catastrophic. It was. Strong shaking damaged a wide area, but the disaster became far more lethal when the sea moved. The earthquake generated a local tsunami that reached parts of the coast within minutes. According to the International Tsunami Information Center, the first wave arrived on Flores within roughly 2 minutes of the initial shock in some locations and reached the north shore within about 5. There was almost no time for organized evacuation in communities without a modern warning system. At Riang Kroko, the tsunami produced an extreme run-up measured as high as about 26 meters. Researchers have suggested that underwater landslides triggered by the earthquake may have contributed to the extraordinary height there. Entire coastal settlements were overwhelmed. The International Tsunami Information Center records approximately 1,690 deaths from the tsunami itself, while USGS historical summaries place the combined earthquake and tsunami death toll at least 2,200 people. Thousands more were injured or displaced, and large sections of Momir were destroyed. The physical devastation was immense, but the event also revealed something about how rapidly danger can change after a coastal earthquake. People first experienced violent shaking. Minutes later, the primary threat in some communities came from the sea. That sequence helped shape later disaster education in Indonesia, where residents in tsunami-prone areas are taught that strong or prolonged coastal shaking can serve as a natural warning to move inland or to higher ground even before an official alert arrives. The technological environment of 1992 was very different from that of 2026. Seismic monitoring existed, but the rapid digital networks, mobile communication, real-time sea level data, and integrated tsunami warning systems now used across Indonesia had not yet been developed to their current form. The country's modern warning architecture was expanded dramatically after later catastrophes, especially the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. By the time the August 2026 earthquake struck, BMKG could analyze preliminary parameters, issue a tsunami warning within minutes, monitor multiple coastal gauges, and cancel the alert after observations showed that dangerous sea level changes were no longer developing. That progress matters, because local tsunamis can arrive too quickly for distant analysis alone to save everyone. Technology reduces uncertainty, but it cannot eliminate the need for immediate public recognition of natural warning signs. The comparison between 1992 and 2026, therefore, is not a claim that the two events were identical. Their rupture details, wave generation, damage patterns, and human consequences differed. What connects them is the same broader tectonic environment. Both emerge from a region where compression behind the volcanic arc can produce powerful thrust earthquakes offshore. The earlier disaster demonstrated what this fault system is capable of under certain conditions. The later one reminded scientists and residents that the system remains active. History, in this context, is evidence rather than prophecy. A fault that produced a devastating earthquake in the past is not following a schedule. The interval between large events does not function like a countdown. Stress accumulates unevenly, individual segments interact, and the amount of strain released in one rupture does not reveal precisely when another will occur. That uncertainty is one of the hardest parts of earthquake science to communicate. The geology can explain why a region is dangerous. It can identify active faults and estimate the largest earthquakes they are capable of producing. It can calculate probabilities over long periods and model the effects of possible ruptures. What it cannot do is look at a fault today and name the exact hour when it will fail. By the evening of August 15th, the sequence beneath Flores was still active, and each additional aftershock added information about the crust's response to the main rupture. The pattern would eventually help researchers refine the fault geometry, estimate which section had slipped, and compare the 2026 event with earlier earthquakes along the Back-Arc system. That scientific work mattered for understanding the future, but it also sharpened a question already circulating far beyond laboratories. If a fault system this powerful had just produced one major rupture, did the remaining aftershocks mean that the danger was gradually declining, or could one of them become the beginning of something larger? Answering that question required separating what aftershocks normally do from the much rarer situation in which an earthquake first labeled the main shock is later reclassified as a foreshock. The distinction between an aftershock and a foreshock is simple only after the sequence is over. If no larger earthquake follows, the magnitude 7 event remains the main shock, and the smaller earthquakes around it are aftershocks. If a still larger rupture occurs nearby and belongs to the same sequence, the labels change in retrospect. The earlier earthquake becomes a foreshock, and the new event becomes the main shock. That language can sound as if seismologists should recognize the difference in advance, but they cannot. A foreshock carries no visible marker announcing that something bigger is coming. Only a later earthquake reveals what role it played. This limitation sits at the center of the fear surrounding Flores. Can a magnitude 7 earthquake be followed by an even larger one? Yes. Is there evidence that this sequence is heading toward that outcome? On the night of August 15th, there was no scientific basis for claiming that a larger rupture was imminent. Globally, the United States Geological Survey estimates that the chance of an earthquake being followed by a larger nearby event within about 1 week is roughly 5%. Most sequences, therefore, do not produce a larger shock. That number is useful for perspective, but it is not a Flores-specific forecast. Local probabilities depend on the actual aftershock sequence, fault, geometry, and measurements that require dedicated analysis. A worldwide average cannot be presented as a precise prediction for one island. What scientists could say with confidence was that the crust north of Flores was still adjusting. By 2 p.m. on August 15th, BMKG had recorded 235 aftershocks ranging from magnitude 2, 5 to 6. 2. The agency also reported that the sequence had not yet shown a clear decline. That did not mean the earthquakes were building towards something larger. Early aftershock sequences can remain vigorous before their frequency begins to fall. BMKG estimated that the natural decay toward more normal levels could take roughly 2 to 3 weeks, based on patterns observed after other damaging Indonesian earthquakes. Even that estimate described a likely process rather than a timetable. Seismicity rarely follows a perfectly smooth curve. Quiet periods can be interrupted by stronger shocks, and a busy interval can suddenly ease. Scientists look for trends across many events rather than assigning meaning to every short-term fluctuation. The physical reason aftershocks occur begins with the rupture itself. When a large section of fault slips, it changes the forces acting on the crust around it. Some areas lose stress, others receive more. Nearby faults and unbroken portions of the same system are left in a different mechanical state from the one they occupied before the earthquake. Researchers often describe this as static stress transfer. The main rupture permanently changes the distribution of stress around the fault. A nearby patch already close to failure may be pushed slightly closer, while another may be moved farther away. These changes help explain why aftershocks cluster in certain areas instead of appearing evenly in all directions. The crust, however, is too complicated for a simple map of dangerous and safe zones. Fault surfaces are irregular. Their orientations differ. Rock properties change with depth, and fluids can alter friction. Calculations can show where failure may have become more or less favorable, but they cannot identify the next earthquake with certainty. Another process operates while seismic waves are still passing through the Earth. These waves temporarily deform the rock, creating dynamic stress. A large earthquake can sometimes trigger activity on faults farther away if those faults are already near failure. The effect has been documented after major earthquakes, but it does not create an unstoppable chain reaction across the planet. Most faults crossed by the waves do not rupture. Those that respond were already carrying their own tectonic stress. This matters because dramatic claims often appear after a large event suggesting that the entire ring of fire has suddenly awakened. Seismology does not support that conclusion. Earthquakes occur around the Pacific every day because its plate boundaries are continuously active. Several major earthquakes appearing in the news close together do not, by themselves, prove a physical connection. Demonstrating triggering requires evidence about timing, distance, seismic waves, fault orientation, and background activity. For Flores, the immediate scientific focus remained near the original rupture. Researchers needed to understand how stress had changed along the Back-Arc system and where the aftershocks were clustering. A major earthquake does not release all tectonic stress from an entire fault network. It releases strain from a particular portion. Adjacent sections may have slipped differently or remained locked. This is one reason the ends of large ruptures receive close attention. Historical sequences show that a first earthquake can sometimes alter conditions near another section that later fails. The 2019 Ridgecrest sequence in California is a useful example. A magnitude 6. 4 earthquake was followed about a day and a half later by a magnitude 7, one event. Only then did the earlier shock become a foreshock in the scientific description of the sequence. Such examples prove that a larger earthquake cannot be ruled out immediately. They do not provide a script for Flores. The faults, loading history, and geometry are different. Earthquake science is strongest when it describes mechanisms and probabilities rather than pretending that one past sequence predicts another. That principle separates forecasting from prediction. A forecast can estimate how likely certain levels of seismic activity are over a period of time. It can state that aftershocks are expected, that their overall frequency generally falls, and that some probability remains for a larger event. Prediction would require the future time, place, and magnitude to be specified in advance with reliable accuracy. That capability does not exist. No scientific agency can announce that a particular fault will produce a magnitude 8 earthquake tomorrow night at a precise location. Claims of that kind should be treated with extreme caution unless supported by recognized scientific institutions, and at present, no accepted method can provide such a prediction. Earthquake early warning is different again. It does not foresee rupture before it begins. Sensors detect the first seismic waves after an earthquake has already started and may send alerts to places that stronger shaking has not yet reached. The available warning can be only seconds, yet those seconds may still help automated systems, transport networks, medical facilities, and individuals. The tsunami alert after the Flores earthquake operated on a related principle. The rupture had already happened, and authorities were estimating what the ocean might do next. None of these technologies removes uncertainty from a fault before it breaks. The inability to predict the next large earthquake can sound like a scientific failure, especially when damaged communities are enduring repeated aftershocks. In reality, monitoring still provides valuable information. Aftershock locations reveal the disturbed region. Their timing and magnitudes show how the sequence is evolving. Seismic waveforms help reconstruct how the rupture propagated, while field observations identify where shaking and ground failure were most severe. Together, these measurements improve understanding of what happened and help guide practical decisions about what remains dangerous. If aftershocks continue, damaged buildings require caution. If slopes have fractured, landslide risk can persist. If another strong or prolonged coastal earthquake occurs, natural tsunami warning behavior remains important even though the earlier alert ended. The scientific answer to the most frightening question was therefore neither reassurance nor alarm. A larger earthquake was physically possible, as it is in a minority of sequences, but nothing available that day established that one was on the way. The evidence instead described an active aftershock sequence whose evolution still needed to be watched. Flores remained in the uncomfortable space between what had already happened and what could not yet be known. Residents could see damaged buildings and blocked roads, but not the stress remaining kilometers below them. Instruments could record every new shock without turning those signals into a clock counting down to another major rupture. As darkness settled over the affected districts and monitoring continued, the practical question shifted away from whether anyone could predict the exact next earthquake. It became how people, emergency services, and weakened infrastructure could function safely while the ground was still adjusting. That period of uncertainty changed the priorities on Flores. The question was no longer how to stop an earthquake, because no one could do that. The task was to reduce the harm caused by everything the earthquake had left unstable. Emergency shelters had to remain available for families who did not trust damaged homes. Engineers and local officials needed to decide which buildings could be used again and which required repairs or demolition. Roads blocked by landslides had to be reopened carefully because clearing one section did not guarantee that the slope above it had stopped moving. Hospitals and clinics had to continue treating injuries while assessing whether their own structures were safe. Water, food, fuel, medicine, communications equipment, and temporary lighting had to reach communities that could not simply return to normal because the strongest shaking had ended. Rescue work continued under these conditions as authorities tried to reach areas that had been isolated by damaged roads and disrupted communications. By the end of August 15th, the confirmed death toll had risen to at least 47, but officials were still describing the figures as provisional. The number mattered, yet it was not a final measure of the disaster. Search teams were still working, some communities remained difficult to reach, and damage assessments were continuing across multiple regencies. In a developing emergency, statistics often arrive before certainty. They are revised not because the event is changing in the past, but because access to information improves in the present. That distinction becomes especially important when people far from the affected area encounter a stream of conflicting numbers online. The most reliable picture comes from agencies that can verify conditions on the ground, even when their reports remain incomplete. For displaced residents, the more immediate problem was where to spend the next night. A temporary shelter provides distance from cracked walls and falling masonry, but it creates new needs of its own. Families require clean water, sanitation, food, medical care, privacy, and information. Children need secure spaces. Older people and those with disabilities may need assistance that standard evacuation plans do not automatically provide. If rain arrives, outdoor gathering areas can become difficult to use. If aftershocks continue, people may hesitate to enter even buildings that have been inspected. Recovery, therefore, begins long before reconstruction. It begins with restoring enough safety and routine for people to make decisions without facing one emergency after another. The condition of buildings would become one of the most important questions in the days ahead. Earthquake resistance is not simply a matter of making a structure heavier or stronger. Buildings must be designed to move without suffering sudden, catastrophic failure. Connections between roofs, walls, beams, columns, and foundations need to remain intact as the ground shifts. Reinforced concrete must contain enough correctly placed steel. Masonry walls need proper anchoring. Construction quality matters as much as the drawing on which a building was planned. In rural areas, older homes may have been built before modern seismic standards were widely enforced. In rapidly developing towns, variations in materials and workmanship can create uneven vulnerability even among buildings standing on the same street. A future earthquake cannot be prevented, but the collapse of a poorly connected wall or an inadequately reinforced column is not an unavoidable geological outcome. It is a risk that engineering can reduce. The same principle applies to infrastructure. The Trans-Flores Highway is more than pavement. It is a lifeline linking towns, ports, hospitals, markets, and emergency services across difficult terrain. When landslides close such a route, the earthquake's influence spreads into logistics, healthcare, food distribution, and rescue. Strengthening resilience, therefore, means thinking beyond individual buildings. Bridges need seismic design and inspection plans. Slopes above critical roads may require monitoring or stabilization. Communication networks need backup power and redundancy. Ports and airfields can become essential when surface routes fail. Emergency supplies must be stored where they can still be reached after the normal transportation system is disrupted. These investments attract less attention than dramatic rescue footage, but they determine how quickly a region can function after the cameras move elsewhere. Coastal communities face an additional layer of responsibility because strong earthquakes can be followed by tsunamis. The warning issued on August 15th showed the value of rapid instrumental monitoring, but the history of Flores demonstrates why technology cannot be the only defense. A local tsunami may arrive before an official message reaches everyone. People who feel severe or prolonged shaking near the coast must understand that moving to higher ground can be the correct action even if a phone has not yet sounded. Evacuation routes need to be recognizable in darkness. Schools, hotels, ports, and villages need plans that do not depend on one person being present. Drills can turn knowledge into movement, reducing the time lost to hesitation. Warning systems work best when instruments, institutions, and public behavior reinforce one another. The earthquake also revealed why disaster education must address misinformation. In the hours after a major rupture, social media can fill with predictions that another earthquake will occur at a particular time, claims that an entire tectonic region has become unstable, or messages warning of a tsunami long after official monitoring has ended the alert. Such statements exploit a natural desire for certainty. They can send people toward unnecessary danger, create panic in shelters, or weaken trust in legitimate warnings. The scientifically responsible message is less dramatic but more useful. Strong aftershocks remain possible. Damaged buildings and unstable slopes deserve caution. Another major earthquake cannot be ruled out, yet its exact occurrence cannot be predicted. Official seismic and tsunami agencies should be followed because their assessments change as observations change. Preparedness is not the same as expecting catastrophe. It is the discipline of acting sensibly while accepting that some uncertainty cannot be removed. Over the following days, the visible work of recovery would involve debris removal, structural inspections, restoring power, repairing roads, supporting displaced families, and documenting losses. The less visible work would continue for much longer. Seismologists would analyze waveforms and map the rupture. Engineers would study which structures failed and why. Disaster planners would review evacuation behavior and communication gaps. Local governments would face decisions about rebuilding in places exposed to landslides or tsunami inundation. Families would decide whether damaged homes could be repaired or had to be replaced. Each decision would convert the earthquake from an event that happened into knowledge that might reduce the consequences of the next one. Indonesia cannot relocate itself away from tectonic boundaries. Flores cannot erase the fault beneath the sea. The forces that built these islands are the same forces that periodically fracture the crust around them. That reality can sound fatalistic only if risk is confused with destiny. The location of a fault is geology. Whether a school collapses, whether a coastal family recognizes a natural tsunami warning, whether an ambulance can reach an isolated village, and whether a damaged building is entered too soon are questions shaped by construction, education, infrastructure, planning, and human judgment. Science is most valuable here not because it can promise a quiet future, but because it identifies where choices matter. Late on August 15th, the island still carried the physical evidence of the morning's rupture. Rescue operations were continuing. Some roads remained difficult or impossible to use. Families were staying away from damaged homes. Instruments kept registering movement beneath the region. No one could know the precise moment when the sequence would finally settle into the background level of seismic activity that existed before the disaster. Nor could anyone guarantee that the largest shock had permanently passed into history. What people could know was how to behave in the uncertainty that remained. They could avoid unsafe structures, respond to verified warnings, keep evacuation routes clear, inspect damaged infrastructure, and rebuild with the next earthquake in mind, rather than treating this one as an exception that would never be repeated. Beneath Flores, tectonic motion would continue after rescue crews left the rubble and news coverage moved elsewhere. The plates would keep converging at a pace too slow for a person to see, storing deformation across faults that reveal themselves only when they move. Above them, communities would repair roads, reopen schools, restore homes, and carry the memory of another morning when the ground suddenly became unfamiliar. That is the lasting meaning of an earthquake in a place like Indonesia. The Earth does not offer a final warning before every rupture, and it does not provide a schedule for the next one. The most durable protection comes from accepting that uncertainty without surrendering to it. Flores cannot choose when the ground will move again. It can only decide what will be standing, what will be understood, and how quickly people will know what to do when it does.